Right. Now that we've had a chance to see the film, it's time for the talk back. So, welcome and good evening. My name is Melissa Murray. I am the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law here at NYU Law, and I'm also the Faculty Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. We are absolutely delighted to be hosting this celebration of Pauli Murray, an incredible and incredibly undersung legal thinker and trailblazer of civil rights and gender justice. Before I introduce our presenters tonight, I want to thank our many co-sponsors, especially the NYU Law Alumni of Color Association, the Black Allied Law Students Association, If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, the Women of Color Collective, and Outlaw. Thank you all so much for your support of this event and this film. As you've all seen in the film, the Reverend Pauli Murray embodied so much of what we champion at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. Pauli Murray was someone who led with authenticity, who exhibited grit and resilience, and who advocated in strategic ways for gender and racial justice. We are so grateful to Julie Cohen and Betsy West for bringing Pauli Murray's story to the screen and to all of us here tonight at NYU. And with all of those caveats duly issued, let me get straight to our speakers who need no introduction. Julie Cohen is one of the directors of My Name is Pauli Murray. She directed this film alongside Betsy West, and this was not their first foray into documentary filmmaking. Previously, Julie and Betsy co-directed RBG, the famed film that was nominated for an Academy Award and chronicled the life of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Before she began making documentaries, Julie was a staff producer for NBC News and the creator and producer of Supreme Court Watch on Court TV. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Brittany Cooper. She is I'm sure those of you who are on Twitter and watch MSNBC know her from her work there. But Dr. Cooper is a professor of women and gender studies at Rutgers University. She's also the co-founder of the Crunk Feminist Collective and the author of 3 books. Most recently, Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. I hope you take the time to follow both of these fantastic women on Twitter. They have lots to say and they say it all so well. But I hope you have questions for them. We'll be fielding questions throughout the program. But until we get to that part, I hope you will join us for what will be a fascinating conversation between these two. So Julie, Brittany, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight and for sharing this incredible film. Audience members, please put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. So Brittany, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. It's good to see you. Hi, Julie. It's good to be here in conversation with you. Hi, everybody watching. So Julie, I want to say thank you for the opportunity your team gave me to talk about one of my favorite people, to help bring Pauli Murray's story to a broader audience. How did you come to know about Pauli's story?
Yeah, well, maybe that's some of the complication of what it really takes to learn something, because it turns out that I had read about Pauli Murray in a feminism book in college, but had no recollection of it. Only later discovered that when one of the editors of that book, Patricia Bell Scott, came on as a consulting producer of our film. We noticed that Justice Ginsburg, back when she was still an attorney as RBG, had put Pauli Murray's name, listing Pauli as a co-author of a brief in the first case the first brief RBG wrote to the Supreme Court, Reed versus Reed, and thought that's interesting. Wasn't really towards the very end of making that film, when I think in the graphics part, when we noticed who are these other names here, that we learned a tiny bit about Pauli Murray, but it was really kind of in the whole Q&A process that you go through going around with the film, where someone actually asked, we know now that maybe today's young lawyers, some of us are standing on the shoulders of RBG. Whose shoulders did RBG stand for? And we started talking a little bit about some of the basic outlines of what we knew about Pauli Murray, and realized that it kind of almost sounded like we were pitching a documentary, and went back to Google and discovered the first of what turned out to be such a huge collection of audio tapes, and ultimately videotapes as well, of Pauli Murray's incredible words, speaking in this penetrating voice, and learned that this archive had been saved and that actually there was the material to tell this story, even when it was someone who had died 35 years prior.
Yeah. One of the questions about that is how Polly has such an expansive life and is so impactful in so many areas. And I'm amazed at the breadth of material that you cover in this film. But how do you distill this down into a story that you can tell, given that expansive archive and level of impact?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long and difficult process, basically, and done, really there were four of us doing this, Betsy and myself, but also Chalea Bridges McMahon, who was the producer of this film, and Cinque Northern, who was the editor. And it really took all of us, because it's almost like a, I mean, like you could say archaeology, but it's really even more like digging like a dog for a bone. There's like so much stuff to go through. There's so many little gems, and it was really just the kind of the process of finding moments that spoke to each of us and starting to build them into little scenes and then figuring out how it all fit together.
Yeah, and and there's a way that Polly had a sense that Polly would be historically significant, right? Which is why the archive is so voluminous. And so when I watch the film, I get the sense that Polly is like, tell it this way, right? Did you have this sense of like that kind of, um, that aggression and drive that characterized Polly's life really comes through?
Yeah, I think you can feel that when you read Pauli's words, but even more listening to the voice, there's just this sense of like, I am speaking to be heard. And, I think everyone that listens to tape of Pauli sort of has the feeling, certainly I had the experience of like, wow, it feels like this person is speaking directly to me. That can't be right. I couldn't have been the intended audience here. But there's something about like that kind of a piercing power to the way that Pauli's speaking that like, I've got something to say, and maybe people don't want to listen, right now, whether it's, in 1943 or 1982 or whatever, but like someday someone's going to want to hear what I've had to say. So luckily for them, I have saved everything and put it in boxes and had my grandniece give it to Harvard.
So one of the things that the film does a really great job of sort of thinking through is the way that Polly's gender identity and identity as a queer person shaped the way that Pauli was received by the civil rights establishment, by folks in Pauli's own time. And I wonder about the deft way that y'all chose to handle the issue of pronouns, of gender, of Pauli's relationship with Renee Barlow in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think it felt clear to us that, it's one of the great tenets of feminism that the personal is political. So for Pauli, the personal was political and professional, and you really can't disentangle all these different strands. And Pauli's thinking, I think, was influenced by the experience of being somebody that really strongly didn't fit in all kinds of ways, but really strongly felt like some, outsiderness attached to a gender identity that wasn't really something that could be openly talked about or clearly described with the language of the day. Although it's actually amazing what a modern, how modern sounding the language is in some of Pauli's writings, even going back to around 1940. It was really just a question of feeling our way to what seemed, it's really hard because Pauli didn't leave a lot of words on, there's so, there was nothing on the audio tapes dealing with these issues. There was nothing in Pauli's autobiography dealing with these issues. There were the letters to the doctors, and Pauli did leave those in what was a pretty carefully curated archive. Chalea noticed that Pauli sometimes would, redact words in documents, and sometimes even tore out some pages of the journal. So Pauli was kind of paying attention to what did and didn't go into this archive. And letters to doctors, asking for what would now be called some gender affirming surgery were in there. So most likely Paulie meant those to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think having spent some time in that archive myself, that Paulie knew that they were ahead of their time. But it's also an interesting moment too. In the film, I tend to use feminine pronouns. It's a thing that I think a lot about. But I wonder, like, your sense of it, because uh, Polly was a little bit contrarian about like identity politics kinds of things, right? And so called herself or their self, called themselves like a, Euro African American preferred Negro to black, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, how should we think about this kind of politics of identification in this moment when we want to make sure that we're affirming how people see themselves in the world?
Yeah, I think the pronouns is really hard with Paulie because there's no reason to know what pronoun Paulie would now have chosen. Um, Certainly during life, everyone, Paulie's family, friends, lovers called Paulie she and her, and that was nothing that Paulie ever, in anything that we could find, objected to at the time, beyond actually in some cases wanting to be called Pete. And wanting to be seen in some circumstances as a man, but on pronouns, there's not a thing. I think the reason why, so kind of like in talking about this, the filmmakers have all tried to just call Paulie, which is a name that Paulie chose. Like,
Yeah.
that was a self-chosen, the given name was Anna Pauline. Paulie chose Paulie pretty early on in life and pretty much stuck with it. I don't know, for the reasons you say, the contrarianness and some very specific thoughts about language, whether Paulie would have loved they, them pronouns.
Yeah.
But the reason I'm not always comfortable saying she, her really has more to do with modern day trans and queer and non-binary folk who are coming to the movie to, wanting to see someone, seeing someone with whom there is a legitimate connection, and to whom, as we learned, as we showed some earlier cuts to people, to whom hearing a lot of she's can feel like, nails on a chalkboard.
Absolutely.
So it's not, and after all, Paulie is no longer living. So as I say, we try to call Paulie, and it kind of helps in a documentary that doesn't have narration, that like,
Yeah.
kind of have a little bit of everything. And actually, there even are some activists today who use he, him pronouns for Paulie. So
Yeah, I look, and I think it's a really important conversation to have because um, you know, because what we don't want to do is do violence. And part of the thing that is so awesome about Polly is that Polly's life is so expansive that Polly means different things to all of us, right? Was there a set of things that you learned that were like surprising? I mean, I feel like Polly is full of surprises, but was there something that like bowled you over that you weren't expecting?
yeah, that is a hard question for this film because literally every single thing about Paulie, starting with like Paulie's name and what Paulie contributed to 20th century American history, comes as a surprise.
That's
Like, the fact that it's a surprise is actually very problematic. Like, a lot of this stuff shouldn't be surprising, but it
Yeah.
is. But like, I found Paulie's writing to be so surprising. Like, so much of it that just rings so true today. And I mean, we didn't include, but like, Paulie's was talking and writing a lot about 1619. Like,
Mhm.
the way Paulie talks about everything kind of feels like this would fit pretty well in 2022. So
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
everything that Paulie did was a surprise. Paulie's relationships with everyone from family members to like Eleanor Roosevelt to like, very hotshot New York corporate liars. It's like, how did these relationships even form? And in most cases they formed because Paulie would just like walk up to someone and be Paulie's self and
That's right.
kind of bowl people over.
That's right. Yeah, Polly called some of that, confrontational style confrontation by typewriter and was always like firing off these letters to people. That's how Polly and Eleanor Roosevelt come to be friends, right? Because Polly talks very crazy to President Roosevelt. So yeah, I one of the things. So look, there's many things we could say about Polly's historic impact in literally it seems like every movement of the 20th century. But I want to talk in this moment about Brown versus Board. Um, in the film, you talk a bit about the way that Paulie's intervention as a third year law student at Howard Law becomes critical to Thurgood Marshall's team and this case, and yet that is not a thing that we tell even to this day in the story. So, can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was, that's certainly one of the facts about Polly that really sticks with people that learn it. Like, wait a second, this is somebody that played a major role. I mean, unlike, RBG's first case, Reed versus Reed, like, actually, that's not a household name. The gender rights cases didn't get, aren't the giant cases of constitutional law. Brown versus Board of Education is probably the thing you spend the most time learning about. Like I did the first year of law school. I like it. That case is a really, really big deal, and nobody's talking about Pauli Murray. So learning that's an incredible fact. We actually went and looked at the paper that Pauli wrote while a student at Howard Law School to just see, like, because Pauli's saying, like, hey, my professors told me they used this argument. And we were like, is it really there? And I really, for those law students listening, I would highly encourage people to go get that paper, or I could even send it to Professor Murray. The paper is actually mostly about how the civil rights cases of the 19th century Supreme Court cases should be overturned. And at the very end, there's 2 pages that just say outline for overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. It's not even an essay. It's like 13 bullet paragraphs. And they are like maybe the most amazing thing about Pauli is that Pauli's writing this still as a law student, like not as someone who's like a Supreme Court litigator or a Supreme Court justice, as at one point Pauli kind of self-nominated to Richard Nixon, and really well thought out, incredibly elegantly reasoned legal arguments, but like so concise. A couple of them that are quite specific end up in the NAACP's brief and ultimately in the Supreme Court opinion from Brown v. Board. One is the use of a case called Buchanan versus Worley, and another, which I think is kind of even more innovative, of using the work of the sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, that to make the point that children, specifically Black children, are being damaged by separate but equal, like are feeling that the pain of just being separated, like and I mean, I don't know how common it was to use psychology and sociology in a Supreme Court argument in the 1950s, but it felt pretty innovative. And she's Pauli specifically citing Gunnar Myrdal's work, and sure enough, so did the NAACP in their brief. So.
Yeah, and I mean, and in many ways, the case turns on that. That becomes the sort of cultural gravitas, right? That's the arguments about the doll test, proving that there's an inherent kind of psychic injury to Black children. It's also really important to say too that one of the reasons Pauli knows about many of those cases in that period between 1943 and 1944 is because Pauli and all of these young folks that Pauli mentored at Howard undergrad were desegregating U Street now in Washington, D.C. at that time, and they used those Reconstruction era laws as the basis, right, for much of that work. And so and then those cases will be used in the 2 years prior to Brown v. Board in 1952, when Washington, D.C. desegregates. And Mary Church Terrell, the famed civil rights activist of an earlier era, brings that. But Pauli Murray meets Mary Church Terrell in that 1940s moment, right? So there's so much exciting, Pauli's in every room, it seems like, where it happens. You know what I mean? And so I want to say, so you mentioned this, but I want to go back. You said this thing about how Polly then self-nominates to Richard Nixon, like about the Supreme Court. And so we're literally waiting with bated breath to see who's going to be the first Black woman nominee to ever sit on the Supreme Court. This is a hugely historic moment. And so I wonder if you would just give us a little bit of context for Polly Murray confronting Richard Nixon via typewriter about the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is in 1972. I mean, Polly just wrote this is one of like the many incredible Polly chapters that didn't sort of random Polly pieces that didn't make in the film. It's a little hard to tell. The tone of the letter is, I would say, somewhat winking. It's like there's like some irony there. I am not sure. I think it was really almost meant. It had like an op-ed flavor to it, almost like. Why not me when you think about it? Like, why is that such a crazy idea? Like, think about that for a second, readers. I don't know to the extent to which it got public attention at the time that it was written. It's a pretty great nomination letter. But it was like the kind of thing that Polly Murray was doing on like a nightly basis, like staying up, like writing clever, I mean, this is someone who got a lot of letters to the editor published in the New York Times and just like, as well as, throughout the Black press, just somebody who was just constantly writing very, very readable stuff for a whole variety of purposes, but mostly to be thought provoking, I think.
Yeah, and I think, we're literally 50 years out. So if that's 1972, we're 50 years out, right? From Polly Murray saying to Richard Nixon, like, hey, and so when we think about one of the things that becomes really important that I think this film highlights is long struggle. So even when you begin in those opening lines with Polly Murray desegregating a bus with Polly's friend Adeline McBean, and there's that great, sort of, pull quote where you say, this is 15 years, right, before Rosa Parks. We have a very contained narrative of civil rights, and Polly just explodes it every which way you look, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes our point in bringing those thoughts to the fore graphically in the film was just to broaden the conversation to also being about, just remember how limited the history that we learned in school can be. It's been a little frustrating to often be in situations where people are saying like, and Polly was the first, Black person to be sitting, and like, no, if one is looking through the Black press from the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, as we were, like, for not substantive research, but like graphics purposes, you actually find that this was something happening all the time, including the case that led to Plessy versus Ferguson. That was on a train, but like, it's not like the laws, the apparatus, the sort of legal apparatus of white supremacy wasn't being challenged. It was being challenged throughout. Yeah. It's not something we're generally taught in school. Yeah. Like, why that is.
Yeah. And it's, and it is really important to say, for if people want book references, you can read Blair Kelly's Right to Ride. You can read Mia Bay's Traveling Black. Those are good books that sort of talk about this long history of transportation activism. But one of the things too, just because, you and I were talking beforehand about, this is a law school community. And so Polly Murray is not just like the sort of senior law student architect of Brown v. Board. Polly Murray is the first Black deputy DA of California, which is to say you don't get a Kamala Harris, right, without Polly Murray, right? Polly Murray's the first Black woman to get a doctor of law from Yale Law School. How the level of first, and I know I have asked this, but how does it feel to like see all of that and not be able to put every single one of those things like in the film, even though I know a lot of it is?
Yes, it was hard, but the decision was made very early on. Like, wow, we are going to leave out a lot in this. We're going to leave out a lot. We created at some point early on, I think it was before the editor was even involved, Talea and Betsy and I created a list that I think was like 103 life episodes, and just went through sort of discussing and debating. Interestingly, for all of the ways that we sometimes saw things differently, in that process, we had pretty general agreement. Like, yeah, and it was mostly just because things were like, that would get so complicated. That's so its own movie. I mean, one good example is the Odell Waller case, situation where Pauley was very involved in trying to fight the death penalty for a black sharecropper who had been convicted of killing a landlord. It's a fascinating case. Again, law students would be interested to look at it, and it was actually a huge, big deal case. It was like in the FDR administration, it got tons of national attention very broadly. Very, 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 very interesting case of the day. But like, you can't really say someone was working on trying to stop an execution without really backing up and getting into every fact of the case and all that. And it's actually a fairly complex and really interesting case. So we're like, we're like, I think, the book that Pauley wrote about for the Methodist Church, where she's outlining, every segregation law going through the country, creating a compendium, which I think in this day and age, it's actually hard to in the world that we live on, where you can just go online and find this information. Like, there was no Google, there was no LexisNexis in Pauley's day, and Pauley's traveling around, Proud Shoes, the book that we actually, that was one that at the end we sandwiched it in. We at least mentioned it in the film, because we were like, we can't bear for that not to be mentioned, because that of everything that Pauley's done, that's actually probably the thing that I've found the most stunning. It's an incredible book about 19th century American history in a way that you've never heard it before. And this is someone who's not even a historian. Like,
yeah. In the archive, Pauley has all these index cards where they wrote the citations for that book. And so the research is meticulous, right? Yeah. Which is also, I mean, it's this kind of, the ability to both see the big picture and be that meticulous typically don't go together. And yet with Pauley, it's both of those things, right?
Right. It's everything that nonfiction authors try to do today. It really reads like a novel, which is not how people were writing nonfiction in the 50s. And Pauley's traveling around the country, going to courthouses, looking for records of that, looking at something that happened with her grandfather, great grandfather maybe, and trying to make the connections to the Civil War battles that were actually relevant, and through county records. It's amazing.
It really should be studied as an important kind of genre bending book in many ways. But and Pauley's an interdisciplinary scholar, which is a thing I think you were gesturing toward earlier. That work where Pauley brings the sociologist in on the law case. So then when Pauley gets to Yale, it's that 1,300-page dissertation, right? First of all, anybody has written a dissertation, you're like, 1,300 pages? Why? Like, how? For what purpose? Right? But it's this kind of expansive, like, it's psychology, it's sociology, it's law, and this is the dissertation for the doctorate of law. And so even at the level of like genre and method, y'all can see that it's become a Pauli Murray fan club, right? Because there's no way to dig into this story and not come to love to love Pauley's mind, right? Yeah. So let me look at my notes because I got excited. So I want to talk a bit about the pivot near the end of Pauley's life to the church, right? The way that, so it feels to me like Pauley was like, I'm going to try to understand my life, in terms of the scientific. Okay, that's not totally working. I'm going to try to understand it in, terms of law. And so why do you think that Pauley ultimately concludes that like religion is going to be the nexus of social change, given all of the places that Pauley had intervened to try to bring about a different kind of world?
Yeah, I feel like the answer to that brings you into your own thoughts about, in some ways, I mean, I really believe in religion. I have I'm not big on organized religion, but I have religious feelings myself, and believe in God and all that. But there is a way to look at it. It's like, when do you turn to God? It's when you're really desperate. Like you're wanting to get justice through the court system and through, through politics and, through protesting on the streets, and it's not getting there, like, then you're, well, maybe like, maybe I'm gonna look to my Lord and Savior for that. I mean, so there's one part of it as being maybe a last resort step. I'm sure that's not how Polly would have described it. I think the thought was, through Polly's own description, it actually had to do with the spiritual crisis that resulted from grief over Reenie's death and from coming into terms with Polly's own mortality and just realizing, like, we don't have forever on this planet, and what's most important is there's a really good quote from Polly that unfortunately wasn't read out loud, that in the end we didn't include in the book. I wish I did. I wish I had it here. But basically, in the end, I want to return to the one for whom there is no black nor white, no male nor female, no north or south, just like the love of the one big umbrella thing, which is Jesus and Polly's conception, like bringing it all together. And like,
yeah, no, I love that. I mean, it's a riff on Galatians 3:28, which is super expansive, and Galatians 3:28 says there's no male nor female too.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I also just wanted to note for our law students, other books. So it States Laws on Race and Color that Julie was referring to. That's the compendium. Polly also wrote the first book of constitutional law for Ghana right after independence. Spends a year there, but did you?
Yes, I have not read that one. Have you?
No, I have not. But what's funny in the archive is, like, Polly's like, I have decided that I am not African. I am American. I am American. It's a super, yeah. So y'all put your questions in the chat. We're getting ready to come to the Q&A. What do you think? I mean, we're in this moment of like social upheaval, but you open this film with this epigraph from Polly saying, like, America, be what you said you are. Be who you said you are. And I wonder, and Polly also looked at the upheaval of the 60s, and for Polly, it was not so different from the upheaval of the 30s and 40s when they were a young person marching, in the early March on Washington movement and all of that. And it feels like we've come back around to it again. What kind of wisdom or what kind of insight do you think Polly would have, or what impression of this moment do you think Polly might have?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. Maybe I feel like Polly's sort of long arc of history view, like all of the great activists who've advanced things forward, Polly was a relentless, sometimes almost a relentless optimist, to the point of, like, you might say, like, what do you have to be optimistic about? But like, Polly was always looking for a way to see a path forward and a light at the end of the tunnel. So I think Polly would still be feeling that, but I do feel like the just intense love for some of the deep principles in the Constitution, albeit principles that our country has never lived up to, was like that love is really comes through in a lot of what Polly writes, and is like really moving. Like it's like we loved that that quote that we put at the top of the film, like just like with such a deep understanding of what American ideals as proclaimed, and like, oh, if only, like.
Yeah. Yes. So I think that's right. And I love that y'all highlighted so prominently, hope is a song in a weary throat. And, and I think it captures even the zeitgeist of our times, right? How do you hope when you're like weary from screaming, from, imploring like the country to let's not go backwards, right? And so it has been helpful to me as a person who writes about Polly Murray's life to sort of recognize that, in every generation that exhaustion comes, and in every generation folks find reasons to hope. And I think that continues to keep me buoyed. So let's see what y'all want to talk about. So we have a few questions. Yeah, so yes, we got one question that just asked, was Polly trans? Well, that language didn't really exist in the early part of Polly's life, but today we would sort of understand Polly as a trans or non-binary person. So I can answer that sort of directly. Yes. One of the first questions we got is, why do you think Polly Murray isn't more well known, even among law students and lawyers? And then, so that's for you, Julie. And then someone asked, how did my students respond to learning about Polly, which I'll answer later.
Yeah, I think there's lots of reasons why Polly isn't more well known. I mean, the kind of more obvious ones would be racism and sexism. And I think those are legitimate major reasons. But I think you also have to look at, like, if Polly had stayed in one lane for a long time, and most people that are known for like a specific thing. Polly, there's so many things to be known for that, like, you almost don't know where to start. So I think a lot of the shifting from movement to movement is a reason. And I also think, we talk about, oh, Polly was so ahead of their time, but when you think about that, that very phrase that we use all the time does suggest that, like, there, that there's a time where you're too soon. I mean, Polly was coming to a lot of ideas too soon. People that get most famous for ideas, like RBG's bringing the women's rights stuff in the 1970s, everyone was probably like, that was an idea whose time had come. Yeah. Well, yes, and actually it had been around for a long time. And Polly Murray had some of those ideas the decade earlier, but it was like ahead of its time. So nobody wanted to hear it. So it didn't like, sometimes you, like, being at the beginning of a wave isn't how you get so well known. And then there's the whole having a personal life that, had it become public, could have really destroyed Polly in all kinds of ways. Polly wanted to avoid that, and it might have led Polly to not speaking up as loudly in some circumstances as Polly otherwise might have.
That's right. I mean, I'm reminded, I mean, this is not untrue of, like, someone like Bayard Rustin, also a queer architect of movements, who it took a while for us to really, give Bayard Rustin his due. And just a note, Polly Murray and Bayard Rustin were friends, but also they fell out with each other, and then they would make up, you know what I mean? Because Polly would fall out with people because Polly was always, confronting people, right? Even you had those wonderful clips in the movie with Karen Ross, Polly's great niece, and Karen sort of alludes to it, right? She could be difficult, she could be difficult, she says. Yes, okay. So we got a question. I noticed, my students, I think that they both were like, why have we never heard of this person? But also for them, this is knowledge coming at a right moment, which is to say they won't be 40 learning this. They're, 18, 19, 20. So hopefully it means we're doing the work right this time around. The next question. I noticed her experience, or Polly's experience, in the labor union movement. Is there a book that goes in deeper detail on Polly's union experience? And is there a book on her religious experience? There's not a singular book on Polly's experience in movements. I would point you to Rosalind Rosenberg's book, Jane Crow, The Life of Polly Murray, is the definitive biography. And there actually is a book of Polly Murray's sermons from 2008, edited by Anthony Penn, that tries to think about Polly's religious thought. So I would begin there. Okay. The film discusses how Murray criticized the Black Power movement for demanding separate dorms and spaces after the prior generation fought for integration. How do you view this perspective of Polly's?
It's not necessarily, I don't think, for me to have a strong view of whether she should have felt that way or not. I mean, we found the conflict that ultimately ended in a warm embrace between Polly and some of the Brandeis students that we had in the film to be like really interesting and beautiful. I mean, part of that, I mean, maybe this is like I'm getting old myself. Like part of it is it's just age. It's like a difference, but like people have different perspectives over time. And you know, Polly, in certain ways, as radical as so many of these ideas were, Polly wasn't, in some ways, wasn't really the most radical thinker in the world. Polly's views were never separatist. They were always really big on reconciliation. Again, sort of leading you back towards a Christianity kind of view of things. I mean, Polly had the, you know, when my brothers draw a circle to exclude me, I'll draw a bigger circle and include them. Like that's a pretty warm, beautiful, but that's a warm, fuzzy notion. That's not too radical, except actually it loops back around because actually being loving and warm towards everyone is perhaps the most radical stance of all. So I don't think I really answered the question, but
yeah, it's you know, and I mean, part of it is that Polly has a deep critique of Black power, and her critique of it is, well, one, she doesn't like the term Black because she thinks that it's too ghettoizing, or that's a more contemporary word, limiting, narrow, right? But Polly also thinks that she derisively refers to the Black Power era folks as the apostles of Black consciousness, and says of them, like, you know, like that they're masculinist, that it's basically a kind of like, you know, penis measuring contest, quite frankly. And so Polly has a critique of the kind of masculine performance that comes out of Black nationalist movements, and sees that as running up against the kind of more inclusive notion of democracy. Can we sort of, like extrapolate that to, for instance, safe space conversations today? I don't think we can, because there's this wonderful moment in the movie, one of my favorites, where y'all talk to Polly's students from Brandeis, right? And it occurs to me that their own sense of camaraderie with Polly is a kind of safe space in the midst of this, right? Did you get a sense of that?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
I mean, a big thing, you know, you have to think that her view of the Black Power movement had a lot to do with the campus context that she was that they were all in. And what Polly disliked the most about the protests were that they were disrupting classes, like, you know.
Yeah. And one of my favorite parts of that story, the famous Black feminist scholar today, Patricia Hill Collins, is one of Pauli Murray's students. And in the biography, Polly says, my senior student, strong student, walks out of class one day and yells Black solidarity. And, you know, and she's like curious about this. So I remember reading that as a graduate student going, could that possibly be the Patricia Hill Collins? And it was, right? Yes. So we're even living in that kind of, you know, knowing that Patricia Hill Collins is a student of Pauli Murray also tells us something about how these movements develop. So you got a question, how does the historical silence on Polly's legacy instruct us in social innovation today? Like, how can we change the structure of leadership and institutions to facilitate insight from everyone? And the person shares, as a Black Christian woman law student, I needed to know about Polly's contributions, ideas, and gender struggles years ago. I deeply resonated with Dolores's sentiment that learning about Polly is a joy and pride, followed by rage at the fact that Polly's life was obscured from historical celebration and that Polly's happiness was so proscribed. Thoughts about this?
Is that answerable? I could get you like that's,
yeah, how does the silence on Polly, like what might it prompt us towards in this moment? Like,
yeah, I think in some ways it prompts us towards like, I mean, I don't want to be like, here we are at a great, you know, the great institution of NYU. I don't want to say like, don't only listen to what you're learning from your professors, because I'm sure they're all like unbelievably brilliant and fantastic and are not limiting in any way. But like, you know, sort of, you know, especially in the areas of life that are most meaningful to oneself, like, you know, moving forward and trying to make sure that you're really learning and getting information from a wide variety of sources. That's and just also just kind of recognizing the limitations that exists in like sort of our shared knowledge pool that I think you can like I feel like the thing that struck me the most while working on this project was just like a deep like awe at my own ignorance. Like you're like, wow, like look at all of the things, and not just about Pauli Murray specifically, but about some of the historical events that we talk about in the film that shaped Pauli, like the 1943 in Detroit. Like never, and it's not just that I never learned about it. It's like I sort of like I thought I knew things that went on in the like it's just realizing like what you know it's like the now I don't want to be quoting Donald Rumsfeld, but it's like the unknown unknowns. Like there's a lot we don't know.
No, it's true. And I think the most obvious answer too is films like this just invite us to recognize that there are these rich, wonderful stories. And so the silences are only answered by telling stories. So when you learn these stories, tell them, amplify them, and be unapologetic about doing so. Because to me, this film feels like a healing film. I've been thinking and writing about Pauli Murray for 15 years nearly. And just now is Pauli starting to get some of Pauli's due. And so this film, I think people resonate with it, Julie, because it feels like this was history we needed to know and didn't know we needed, right? And right. So it's like a shot of oxygen in thin air, and you're like, oh wow, that's what it feels like to breathe like good air. One of the questions is, one thing we see from Pauli is incredible drive and resilience. They fought so hard and often see wins in their own way, though later down the line. Did you see moments of joy from Pauli in the archives or hear them on the tapes?
Yes, the moments of joy came. A lot of it had to do with dogs. I mean, we have some dog footage, and just the intense connection with animals, with nature, with music, and with Renee. I mean,
yeah,
like Pauli could be a difficult person according to everyone who knew Pauli, although everyone seemed to agree that changed a lot with the move towards religion in the mid 70s. But there was a lot of joy there and a lot of love there. And actually, if you read the poetry, some of which is searing and intense, but also there's some joyful poems too.
That's right. One of the questions we got, the film dignifies Pauli Murray and is honest about the mental health struggles Pauli faced, which could have been delegitimizing. How did you strike this balance?
Yeah, I mean, I actually would say that's probably an area where you should read more, and there's a lot more to say about the complexity of Pauli's mental health struggles, which are really hard to pick apart. How much of that is being forced to live in a gender that didn't feel right, and struggling with racism and even the sexism because of a perception of being a woman. How much of it was a thyroid problem that was ultimately solved later and dramatically treated, and after which Pauli seemed to improve, and how much of it actually was I don't like diagnosing people and going back into history, but something that would have been classified later and probably treated as a mental illness. I think it's really hard to say, and we didn't delve deeply into it in the movie because, again, like there's so many movies that could be made about Pauli Murray, and this is just one of them.
I mean, it's a very good one. Did Eleanor Roosevelt ever comment on her friendship with Pauli? Yeah.
Yeah. So we did include that quote where Eleanor mentions the friendship in a like an essay for I forget what magazine it was, but in the 50s. With the sort of hilarious title of some of my and not meant ironically title like some of my best friends are Negroes. But Eleanor's kind of raving about this incredibly smart, young, lawyer with whom she's often having, great intellectual arguments, and really almost seeming to suggest like this is someone that people should know about. Like,
Yeah, no, that's right. And the person also asked whether Roosevelt had said anything towards the end of Polly's life. Eleanor Roosevelt precedes Polly in death. Polly doesn't die till the early 1980s. Yeah. And then, so just a couple of comments. Polly achieved so much and was revolutionary in so many ways. Here. Also, one attendee says, it's never too late to learn about an extraordinary human being. I'm thankful that I know about Polly now. It is a privilege to be able to teach my daughter about Polly's life. So no, it is never too late. Thank you for a wonderful film. And the final question we have is, what do you think are the best ways to honor Pauli Murray's legacy?
This is pretty simple, but I'd say honor Pauli's legacy by reading Pauli's books. Pauli, of all the many ways Pauli self-identified primarily as a writer. Like, it wasn't law or activism that really thrilled Pauli. It was writing and literature. And if there hadn't been so many barriers that were sort of crying out to be fought, Pauli would have just written. And I think with that level of focus, may have been able to be, to move to point to be recognized as one of the greatest 20th century American writers. So, I mean, that it sounds like it might sound like I'm exaggerating until you get Proud Shoes and Dark Testament and just read them over a weekend. Like, yeah.
Pauli, there was really not much that Pauli didn't do at a stellar level. I often think about Pauli like as a forerunner to womanist theology. Pauli helped create the Department of American Studies at Brandeis, the Department of Legal Studies, all of these disciplines that are just new. Pauli creates one of the original sort of conceptions of intersection. I mean, we could go on, but we won't. We'll just say, if you're intrigued, read, watch this film, share it with folks that you love, watch it again and again. Thank you so much to all of you at NYU Law for the opportunity to talk about this. Thank you, Julie, and your team, Betsy, Talea, Sinke. Thank all of you for this amazing, amazing film.
Thank you so much, Professor Cooper.
Echoing those thanks. Thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. The film is incredible, but this conversation added so much depth for our students, for everyone who has been able to attend and who will view it online after the fact. So thank you for sharing all of these wonderful thoughts. So thank you also to our audience. Thank you to our co-sponsors, NYU Law Alumni of Color Association, the Black Eyelid Law Students Association, If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, the Women of Color Collective, and Outlaw here at NYU Law. So please, reiterating, share the incredible film widely. And if you're interested in more on all of these topics and sort of how some of this is coming into the future, please join us next week at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, where we're going to be discussing intersecting identities, so gender, race, and the politics of Supreme Court nominations, with Alicia Menendez, Debo Adegbile, Tiffany Gardner, and Amy Allison. So we're so excited for all of our upcoming events. So excited that this one was such a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and can't wait to see everyone again soon. Thanks again.